Hello, everyone. Today is February 24th, 2022. Thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 3, Greenhouse Gas Accounting and Cost meeting. My name is Brenda Corona here with the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO. I will be co-facilitating today's meeting, and I'm also joined here with Kevin Head, who will be our facilitator, and Brian Jacobson, who will be our scribe. A few meeting reminders are that for this meeting, we are encouraging different dialogue and engage different perspectives and keep comments brief, professional, and respectful. This video will be recorded and posted publicly at the ISO stakeholder page, and any transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will pause for questions after each item, and if you do have to raise your hand, please use the virtual raise hand icon above the chat window, or if you joined via audio, please press #2 on your device. After you finish asking your question, we kindly ask you to put your hand down so we could go ahead and go to other attendees who wish to ask a question. But if at any time you have any technical assistance, please let me know during our chat, and also remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment, so you may be able to chat with everyone on panelists. In today's agenda, we will go ahead and kick it off with Kevin Head, and then we'll have two of our California ISO experts here for the resource-specific approach version 2.0 presentation, and then we'll do a follow-up on a Q&A, recap on discussion, and then Kevin will wrap it up with upcoming topics for this meeting. And then I can go ahead and let Kevin Head go ahead, take off this meeting, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Brenda, and welcome everybody to working group number 3 for the Extended Day Ahead Market. We got a really fun treat today. No, the treat is not having to listen to me drone on for 2 hours, but instead we have Anya Gilbert and George Angelidis from the California ISO to present the version 2.0 of the resource-specific approach. And what I'm hoping to get out of that today is really provide that base level understanding of this updated version of the approach so that we as a working group can perform an evaluation of that approach against the objectives that we had laid out. So I'm hoping that this can be a really good comprehensive description of the approach, and we're able to flesh out the details that we feel that we need to have in order for us to proceed. So I don't have much more of an introduction than that, other than to encourage Anya to take pauses and raise when she's willing to take questions so that we can keep that queue of questions going. So I will turn it over to Anya Gilbert, and yeah, go for it, Anya.
All right, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. I work in CAISO's policy development team, and I will be joined in today's presentation by George Angelidis, who is an executive principal in our Power Systems and Market Technology group. And just a moment as I move to the next slide. So I'll be walking through CAISO's current thinking on greenhouse gas design before I do turn things over to George, who will spend some time discussing using the EDAM RSC optimization model, which is important for this working group as we're proposing that it be used as a base schedule for secondary dispatch accounting. So I did want to start this discussion by clarifying the interaction between CAISO's greenhouse gas design and state greenhouse gas policy that have been occasionally touched on in the working group context through questions or comments, and as a result, it is something we'd like to make specific. Our market design effort isn't seeking to reshape greenhouse gas accounting or reduction policy objectives at the state or federal level, or change state or federal laws. Really, our efforts here are to ensure accurate accounting of greenhouse gas emission costs incurred by sellers of power, to reflect those costs in our least cost dispatch, and to the extent possible, facilitate any required greenhouse gas reporting by market participants. We are undertaking this effort cognizant of federal and state laws, as well as existing and developing greenhouse gas emission reduction programs. And ultimately, we'll need to align our market design with these laws and programs. So if we do identify elements of a market design that do not align with those laws or programs, we expect to engage relevant authorities to discuss options to bring market design and these programs into alignment. Apologies, I'm having a little trouble moving between the slides. So with that prologue, let me start by saying that the presentation and the discussion we're about to have reflects our current thinking, and our hope here is that it starts to solidify additional pieces for folks so that we can continue refining the proposal with your input. And I've structured this discussion to mirror the framework that we've been talking about in this working group, and that's reflected in the scoping document. So the sections mirror that scoping document. I'll be going through general accounting, some of the approach-specific issues, secondary dispatch, reporting and settlements, before we get to some miscellaneous topics. So on the first topic or scope that we've identified in the general accounting issues section, one of the key questions that we've been discussing is what area should be included for greenhouse gas purposes. And the CAISO is proposing that the greenhouse gas regulation area within a BAA be used. And so to do this, CAISO will associate resources within a greenhouse gas regulation within their BAA. And this means CAISO will use the greenhouse gas regulation area as an independent variable so that you could have multiple greenhouse gas regulation areas within a BAA. We believe this can enable accounting when there's a BAA that spans multiple states, but might operate within different greenhouse gas regulatory areas. So this is a key design feature, which would also require changes to the EIM design. I also recognize this is a question that we received in the homework responses, so please do raise your hand if there are additional questions on this construct. Another scoping issue was if we need to have transmission alignment. However, greenhouse gas transfers and attribution are distinct from BAA transfers or BAA transfer limits. We're really focused here on the attribution itself. And then lastly, when it comes to the question of what availability to serve load in a greenhouse gas compliance area looks like, we are mirroring the EIM design in which this is going to be optional based on hourly greenhouse gas bids submitted. So I know that some of these topics had questions that came up in the homework. I'm not sure if we have any questions. I think I see Callie's hand raised.
Yeah, Callie, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and introduce yourself first, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTS. And apologies if I missed this in your guys' response to the homework questions. But I just want to confirm that as part of your proposal that if a resource, it might not be physically located in a GHG regulation area, but if they have a contract to serve load in that area, will they also be modeled as if they're within that GHG regulation area?
You know, Kelly, we're going to get to some of those topics shortly.
Okay.
So let's pause on that until that slide, but I hope we'll be able to address that in the coming slides.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
That's all I see in terms of hands raised.
All right. So the additional questions the scoping document posed was which costs are included in the market optimization. The costs we're looking at optimizing are the greenhouse gas cost of compliance. We're not looking at including clean energy policies. This is another question that came up in the homework. Specifically, if we have accounting of RPS requirements in the market optimization, we really do see, policies like RPS and clean energy standards as procurement policies, not necessarily a cost to be optimized in the market. So wanted to clarify that from the questions that came in on the homework. And then in terms of the bid, it is the megawatt quantity, the price, and this would be an hourly bid submitted to the market. Other scoping questions included how the emissions should be attributed, meaning resource specific or unspecified. Talked about this a few times. CAISO is proposing a resource specific attribution. And when it comes to the emissions rate, we're looking for a resource specific emissions rate within the EDAM BAA. From a non-EDAM BAA, there are default emissions rates. I've listed those that have been published by CARB and the Washington Department of Ecology. CARB also has a average emissions rate for asset controlling suppliers that are listed here as well. This next slide covers participation options and how the emissions attribution would be treated. First is imports at EDAM boundaries. I recognize this is a broader EDAM question and really a subject that Working Group 2 is discussing when it comes to external resource participation. So I think this is one area where we have linkage with one of the other EDAM working groups. And so after that's resolved in Working Group 2, we can bring that issue back to this working group and discuss how it will impact greenhouse gas attribution. Pseudotied resources, we are planning on including those in the greenhouse gas regulation that they're pseudotied to. I know Kevin covered this a bit last week when he was reviewing the EIM model, but pseudotied resources are physically outside of a BA, but contractually treated as internal generation for the purposes of the market optimization. So as long as that pseudotied resource is in a greenhouse gas regulation area, they'd be included. For wheel-throughs, it really is just movement from export from a non-EDAM BAA to import to a non-EDAM BAA. So this movement doesn't necessarily have a GHG emissions attribution in that region. So I've labeled this as not applicable. For virtual bidding, it is excluded as we are focused on limiting this to physical supply. For energy storage, the attribution would be included if they do submit a greenhouse gas bid for the discharge portion of their battery. And for jointly owned units, they'd be included if they're within the greenhouse gas regulation area. I believe this also was a topic that came up at the January 18th workshop. So it's, there's the possibility of kind of treating this as a kind of parent-child relationship, or really it factors in if it's in that greenhouse gas regulation area or not. And then for self-scheduled resources, they would be included if they submit a greenhouse gas bid and an energy bid. These specific types of participation questions did come up in the homework assignment, so I did want to kind of loop back and see if there are additional questions related to participation options, or if Callie, this, in addition to Callie's question, if this raises additional follow-up questions from stakeholders based on the questions that came in on the homework or what we've reviewed here.
And I'm seeing
All right.
2 questions, one from Callie. So maybe we'll give Callie the floor again so she can clarify her question or see if it answered it, and then we can talk to Doug.
Sounds good.
Hi, it's Callie Wilk with WPTF. So I appreciate this slide, and I guess to the extent all the resources that I'm envisioning are pseudotied, I think this addresses my question, but in the event there might be resources that are not pseudotied, and that has a very specific meaning to the CAISO market. So any resource that's not pseudotied, but might still have a contractual arrangement to serve load within the GHG area. That was my question. I know when we were kind of going down this path in the EIM discussion is referred to as California supply. So I guess my question was, is that concept within your proposal?
Yes. So, is that resource within a given greenhouse gas regulation area as a result of that type of contracting?
Yeah, so it's physically located outside of a GHG area, but contractually it has some sort of arrangement to serve load in the GHG area.
And is it covered under either CARB or the Washington Department of Ecology's reporting program?
That I'm not sure on, but I guess my question is, would that resource be modeled as within the GHG region in your proposal? So it might not necessarily be a pseudotype.
Yeah, so
hey, George.
For greenhouse gas purposes, it can be considered a pseudotype to the greenhouse gas regulation area. So just for the greenhouse gas attribution, we can consider this resource as being part of the greenhouse gas regulation area with which it has a contract to provide energy.
Okay, so pseudotype here doesn't mean the same specific meaning as it does in the CAISO market. It's just any resource that has a contractual arrangement to serve load in the GHG area.
Yes, because the greenhouse gas attribution is an accounting mechanism and it doesn't relate specifically to physical flow of energy, we have some freedom to do things like that, like considering the resource as part of the greenhouse gas regulation area. If it has
okay, that makes sense. Yep, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Colin. Good question. So we'll move on to Doug Howe. Doug, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi, Kevin. This is Doug Howe with the PUC MLU group. My question goes to self-scheduled resources, the last row in your table there. And this could be a semantic problem on my part. I think of self-scheduled resources as being resources that are submitted in a schedule with an offsetting amount of load so that effectively they're not included in the optimization. But your descriptions say they're included if they submit a GHG bid and an energy bid. I'm not quite sure I understand how a self-scheduled resource submits an energy bid. Could you clarify that a bit for me?
Yes, let me try to do that. This is George Angelidis. So the fact that the resource may have a self-schedule, that doesn't prevent it from having also an energy bid. So in effect, there could be an energy bid for additional capacity above the self-schedule, so they can coexist. And to participate in the greenhouse gas regulation program, you must have an energy bid because the attribution is limited by your capacity that is dispatched. You could potentially have a self-schedule and an energy bid that is for additional capacity above your self-schedule, and you can submit a greenhouse gas bid that would apply to that additional capacity above the self-schedule. Now, for reasons that we explained earlier, if you have a situation like that, it is possible that you could be getting a greenhouse gas attribution even for a portion of your self-schedule if if the resource is scheduled optimally above the self-schedule, but it was allowed a higher greenhouse gas capacity bid. But the notion that resources in the market is not correct. They are actually included, and the self-schedules are just simply high priority schedules that clear the market. In extreme circumstances, we may even cut the self-schedule for congestion management if it cannot be accommodated by the capacity of the grid. So they are part of the market optimization. They're not excluded. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That clears up the question for me.
All right, and I see Stuart Kelly's hand up. Can we unmute Stuart's line?
Thank you, Anya. Just to make sure I'm completely clear, for jointly owned units, their designation, be it GHG or non-GHG, will be determined by their physical location, but that does not preclude a joint owner from pseudotying a logical share to another area, be it GHG or non-GHG, but however, if they are dynamically scheduling, their designation will be driven by the physical location. Is that correct?
They can be
no,
pseudotied if that's it. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, so let's clarify this a little bit. It's a complicated scenario. So you're thinking of a jointly owned unit that has multiple shares, and potentially the shares could belong to different BAAs. They could be pseudotied to different BAAs. So you're asking, how do we handle that in greenhouse gas modeling? So if the resource is physically located within a greenhouse gas regulation area, all right, because the energy is produced in this greenhouse gas regulation area, then the entire resource and all its children are subject to the greenhouse gas regulation for that area. Even if you have some children that are pseudotied to other BAAs, the pseudotied children, although they belong to different BAAs, they're still subject to the greenhouse gas regulations of the area where they're physically located, because that's where the emissions take place. Right? You understand that? Now, the opposite direction. Yeah.
No, that helps, George. Thank you.
Yeah, and in the opposite way, if the resource is residing outside the greenhouse gas regulation area, but you may have a share that has a contract with, let's say, an LSC in that greenhouse gas regulation area for providing energy, then similar to the question that I answered from Kelly before, we can consider, or we will consider this share as being part of the greenhouse gas regulation area because of its contract, although it's physically located outside the greenhouse gas regulation area.
Got it. Follow the logic. Thank you.
Cool. I think those are all the hands I see up, Anya. If anybody else has any, feel free to raise your hand, but it's back to you, Anya.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. So the next topic is how this proposal works with multiple greenhouse gas zones. And I frame this between how this would work for a resource that would bid under kind of a construct with linkage in the top table, or assuming there isn't linkage in the bottom table. And in a linked state of the world, resources in a greenhouse gas zone have an embedded greenhouse gas cost in their energy bid. These resources are including their applicable greenhouse gas regulation costs imposed in their area and their energy bid. It's only resources outside of the greenhouse gas zone that want to offer into the greenhouse gas zone that would have a resource-specific bid adder and receive a GHG allocation. However, in a state of the world without linkage, and I've included California and Washington since they're the first programs we have anticipated at the launch of EDAM, for a resource outside of the greenhouse gas zone, offering to California would have a GHG bid adder, offering to Washington would have a greenhouse gas bid adder. But as I've noted below, in this initial phase of implementation, the CAISO isn't proposing to build functionality to support cross-regulation area greenhouse gas attributions, meaning supporting a greenhouse gas bid adder from California to Washington or Washington to California. This came up in the homework questions as well from PGP and WRA around multiple greenhouse gas zones. So this is a topic that we can continue to explore, something that the model can address in the future, but is not something that we're proposing with the initial launch on day one of EDAM. I think this also answers some of the questions that came in from PAC around an emitting resource in a greenhouse gas zone ever being dispatched to another greenhouse gas zone. So at the initial launch of EDAM, we're not proposing that resources in a greenhouse gas zone bid into another greenhouse gas zone. Kind of related to accounting for these multiple zones, there were some questions that came in asking how the algorithm will determine or prioritize between zones, and it really depends on the economic dispatch for the resources for the co-optimization. So the shift factors will also determine that allocation based on the co-optimization. So the percentage going to California or in Washington can help determine that the megawatts. So for example, if the marginal cost was 10 and the percentage was 60% California, 40% Washington, we now have a ratio of where the energy went and would pay the resource $6 as a result of the allocation to California and $4 as a result of the allocation to Washington. So wanted to provide just an update on our current thinking around linkage here and the kind of aspect of how we're approaching this at the initial launch. I see a hand up from Vijay. Can we unmute his line?
Yes, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Anja. This is Vijay with WRA. I really appreciate the thought being put in here and being it's kind of futuristic thinking. Two questions. One, you said we at the start of the EDAM going live, you may not build the complete capability for multiple zones. I would like to better understand what you meant by that, but I have a very silly question is more importantly, what do you mean by linkage? What exactly would be linked in terms of the operational elements? Thank you.
I know that there are very specific definitions that these programs have when it comes to linkage. So I'd like to kind of defer to those CARB and Washington definitions of linkage. Okay. But when we're thinking about it as a common price is one aspect in terms of, so that's for your latter question. For the former question in terms of kind of the thinking around this, I do want to invite George to speak to some of his thoughts around kind of this initial phased approach with the launch of EDAM and kind of the link between California and Washington in terms of how those bids might be structured.
Sure, that'd be great. Before George speaks, I just want to highlight a thought on this is this is a very big opportunity you have with building the EDAM. If you plan for 100 cars and then you only have 60, that's better. But if you're planning for only 70 cars, when you get 60 already, you'll be coming back into a new process to build things. So I'm just requesting the long-term thinking not to be ignored in the immediate, but that's just my thought. But please, George, thank you.
Yes. Hello, this is George Angelidis. Let me first speak a little bit on what we understand when we refer to linkage between greenhouse gas regulation policies. And it could be that these two greenhouse gas regulation areas have a common policy with respect to what is the emission cost that is assigned to resources with an established methodology that's agreed upon, or there could be a reciprocity that resources in one of the greenhouse gas regulation areas are subject to greenhouse gas regulation policy and rules, and resources in the other greenhouse gas regulation are subject to their own regulation. But then when you have exports from that regulation area going as imports into another greenhouse gas regulation area, the programs, there is some reciprocity that there is no additional regulation cost imposed on that. So there are different ways, and we'll see how it will play out. But for the time being, and definitely for what we proposed for the initial implementation of day one of EDAM, in the interest of trying to simplify as much as possible the initial implementation, we don't see a great value in supporting cross-regulation area additional regulation costs. I'm going to describe this with an example. Let's say California is a greenhouse gas regulation area and is a net exporter at any given hour. And Washington is another greenhouse gas regulation area, and it's a net importer for that same hour. You can potentially deem some of the California exports to be imports into Washington for serving Washington load. Of course, California exports come from energy produced in California, and it's already subject to greenhouse gas regulation based on CARB. So now, if the programs are not linked, potentially those imports, those exports from California that are imports into Washington, could bear additional regulation cost subject to Washington greenhouse gas regulation. And we do not believe that even if we provide a software support for this feature will be at all useful, because at least for emitting resources, if you're already subject to regulation costs in California for producing energy, why would you be subjected voluntarily to additional regulation costs for importing into Washington? We don't see this as a viable and useful feature. Of course, for non-emitting resources, that may be different, because non-emitting resources will not see really an additional cost, but there's still the additional burden of having to report additional energy imports into another greenhouse gas regulation area. So in any case, we don't see much value to have this feature, which is a little bit complicated to implement already from day one. And eventually, when these different regulation policies are aligned, there is some reciprocity or some link between them, essentially whatever we're going to develop is going to be obsolete and we're going to throw it away. So we don't see much value for increasing the burden of implementation for EDAM all the way from day one to have that feature. And that's why we're proposing not to build this particular feature, and we'll keep things simple on day one by essentially having all resources within any greenhouse gas regulation area not submitting greenhouse gas bids, essentially internalizing their greenhouse gas regulation costs in their energy bid, and simply supporting greenhouse gas bids for resources outside greenhouse gas regulation areas, and there will be different bids for the different greenhouse gas regulation areas. So in the case of Washington and California, a resource located outside of Washington and outside of California could have two greenhouse gas regulation bids, one for energy deemed to be imported into California, and another for energy deemed to be imported into Washington. So that part we will support because, of course, it's very useful and we need it. But the other part for cross-export to imports between greenhouse gas regulation areas, we just don't see much value of it at this point. Thank you.
Thank you for that detailed explanation. Thank you. Thanks, Anja.
Thank you, Vijay. I did see a question come in through the chat. So Anya, I'll go ahead and read that, and if you wouldn't mind responding. So it's Kyle Frankowicz from Tacoma Power, and he asks on slide 9, does the NA mean resources within greenhouse gas zone 1 would not be able to export energy to zone 2? I understand how a market participant might not want to be subject to 2 different greenhouse gas regulatory frameworks, but I'm not clear on what that means for the optimization.
Yes, Kevin, thank you. This is George Angelo. That's a good observation. For the optimization model, that simply means that for any net imports into a greenhouse gas regulation area, we will distribute greenhouse gas attribution to external resources in outside of all greenhouse gas regulation areas, and only to them. So let's say in the previous example, Washington is importing energy and California is exporting energy. We will attribute the net import into Washington to resources that bid greenhouse gas bids, and these are resources external to both California and Washington. So there's not going to be any cross-attribution saying that some of the import into Washington is coming from California. All of it will be attributed to external resources. Again, this is attribution. That doesn't mean where the electrons go. That's a different story, right? This is greenhouse gas attribution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Kyle has a follow-up on that. So he says, okay, so the optimization will quote unquote see resources in a different greenhouse gas zone will be through 2 bids for the same resources, 1 for each greenhouse gas zone. I think he's asking if for a resource in...
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. For a resource that is in an area that doesn't have greenhouse gas regulation, so outside, let's call this resource external for ease of discussion here. This resource could have multiple greenhouse gas bids, 1 bid for each greenhouse gas regulation area for deeming part of their energy schedule to be imported in that particular greenhouse gas regulation area.
But if you're in a greenhouse gas zone, you will not have a separate greenhouse gas bid adder to serve the other greenhouse gas zone. It's just implied in
Yes, so that's right. So that's the simplification that we're proposing for day 1, because otherwise we would have to support greenhouse gas bids for every resource in the system. And we just don't see the value of that. Now, there is an impact on the optimal solution, to go back to the original question, because we only import into a greenhouse gas regulation area what we can attribute. So by restricting the attribution to resources outside greenhouse gas regulation areas, you might be artificially reducing imports into the greenhouse gas regulation area, but of course, that is not a concern, at least initially in EDAM, because there are so many resources outside of greenhouse gas regulation areas. Now, as greenhouse gas regulation areas are expanding, or you have more states adopting policies, this may not be the case. But then again, as these programs evolve, there might be some reciprocity in the development of these policies or link. So again, that will lead us to another solution where essentially, if the programs are linked, then of course you will have attribution of exports from California into imports into Washington, but there's not going to be a need for any greenhouse gas bid for that, because they will be deemed to be at 0 emitting cost, because they have already fulfilled the greenhouse gas regulation as being part of the California greenhouse gas area. So there are different ways that we can handle this in the future, and it all depends on how these programs will be developed.
Yep. Okay. Great answer, George, and thank you. If anybody, I'm not seeing any other hands in the queue. So it seems like your explanations were good. So Anya, back to you.
Sure. So keeping with the scoping document, there's a section on approach-specific issues and questions around what the base schedule would be for secondary dispatch accounting. And our key design objective is to really minimize and quantify the secondary dispatch as a result of a market that's really optimizing resources and loads across the greenhouse gas regulation area and non-greenhouse gas regulation area. So as many of you remember, at the January 18th meeting, the CAISO proposed a REC B+1 solution as the counterfactual, but in light of some of the evolution of the RFC discussions that have been shifting from using a screening method to something more elaborate, we're looking at using that solution for meeting the RFC requirement, using it as a baseline for understanding secondary dispatch. So George is going to talk more about this in the second half of this presentation, but wanted to kind of flag, what's coming up next and how we're thinking about what will be used as the baseline for that counterfactual. So secondary dispatch is kind of the third area of our scoping document. I'll flag that this is an issue that every greenhouse gas proposal in EDAM will need to address. A market based on least cost dispatch is going to inherently send cleaner resources to a greenhouse gas zone because those low emitting resources face fewer or no cost to comply with greenhouse gas regulations. And in some instances, we'll see higher emitting resources backfilling dispatch to serve load in a non-greenhouse gas zone. So we don't currently have estimates of what secondary dispatch will be in EDAM, as EDAM hasn't launched, but we do recognize that the volume of megawatts will be higher that roll over to real time. But there are some means to limit secondary dispatch through transfer limits, through the net export of a BAA, and by capping the greenhouse gas attribution to the energy bid volume above the base schedule can all reduce secondary dispatch. And I'll note kind of another area that we've been exploring as a working group includes what changes are we proposing in EDAM that might apply to the EAM, and this issue of limiting greenhouse gas attributes to the net export transfer out from the BAA is one of those areas where we see it providing benefits in EDAM and also extending that to the EIM. For the reporting and settlement section, just a note on E-tags that the attribution is really what's reported. The E-tags aren't used for accounting for greenhouse gas attributions. And really when we move to the greenhouse gas regulation area instead of the BAs, we'll be using the greenhouse gas regulation area and the greenhouse gas transfer area for that attribution. This has the same concept as E-tags, but it doesn't have the operational connection with the tags. But we don't see an issue from a modeling or reporting perspective. For greenhouse gas attribution, this really is rolling over from EDAM to the real-time market. When it comes to reporting for a regulatory perspective, kind of keeping with the EIM, we are planning on reporting RTD greenhouse gas attributions to regulatory agencies. And a final category of reporting, and there's been quite a bit of discussion in this working group about informational reporting. The CAISO does anticipate that we could support sharing information on greenhouse gas specific information with Regis, depending on what those reporting requirements evolve into, to help support kind of some of the REC accounting questions, and then the quantity of secondary dispatch once EDAM launches. the second half of the reporting and settlement discussion. For settlements, it really is the day-ahead greenhouse gas attribution, followed by an incremental greenhouse gas attribution settlement for any deviation. And really, the greenhouse gas allocations re-optimized in 15-minute market and then 5-minute market. So if the greenhouse gas allocation to a greenhouse gas regulation area is lower than the one in the previous market run, the market participant could buy back the difference of the corresponding marginal greenhouse gas regulation price, similar to the energy settlement. And it's really the market participant assuming the reporting responsibility only for the 5-minute greenhouse gas allocations, where they need to acquire greenhouse gas compliance instruments depending on the resource emission rate. For compensation, generators outside of a greenhouse gas zone with a greenhouse gas bid would be compensated based on the marginal cost difference between serving load in a greenhouse gas zone and serving load outside of that area. And hopefully this helps address some of the questions that SRP raised in their questions on settlements. Our final section was a miscellaneous category, and wanted to clarify that when we move from EDAM to EIM, it's really a EDAM schedule that moved into becoming the EIMB schedule. There are some questions that arose in terms of the bidding changes that would be allowed between EDAM and EIM. From a greenhouse gas quantity perspective, yes. From a price perspective, no. And then questions around the reflection of the cost reference levels, really within that greenhouse gas regulation area, they'd be included based on the existing index price and the resources specific characteristics, such as their emissions rate, their heat rate, whereas external to that area, the greenhouse gas regulation area, the cap would be based on the greenhouse gas index price. And I think an area that has been flagged in the past has been, should the indices that are used today be updated or not, and definitely open to discussing that topic more. I'll pause there for questions, and if there aren't any questions, we can pass it over to George to talk a little bit more about the EDAM RSE optimization model being used as the base schedule for secondary dispatch.
Yeah, hey Anya, it's Kevin. We have a question from Jeff Spires. Maybe we'll go to Jeff first.
Hi Anya, this is Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thank you for the presentation. I just had a question regarding what you mentioned around potentially adding a new constraint to the deeming algorithm of limiting the quantity of resources that are assigned GHG responsibility within a BA to the net export, and that might be something that could also be added to the EIM. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, including what the impact would be, if any, to the way that the GHG pricing would work.
Sure. So I'll defer to George on this
George.
And the model. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jeff, we may have discussed this in the past. Basically, moved by your concerns that you presented in your presentation in this work group early on, that the current greenhouse gas attribution mechanism does not consider any kind of transmission constraints, of course, any kind of transfer constraints. It's an accounting mechanism in which all resources outside greenhouse gas regulation areas, they're considered the same, evenly, without any particular consideration on their location, which BAA they are. So this potentially results in a situation where the aggregate greenhouse gas attribution that resources in a BAA receive may be in excess of the net export transfer that this BAA has, or even worse, you may have a BAA that is importing, that's a net importer, it still receives greenhouse gas attributions for some of the resources in there, and that looks to be counterintuitive. If really the net flow of energy is an import, why would these resources get an attribution to serve load in California or in whatever greenhouse gas regulation area we're talking about? So what we were proposing here is to include additional constraints in the greenhouse gas attribution model to recognize that fact and limit the aggregate attribution that resources in a BAA receive, limit that to the net export of transfers from that BAA. So if the optimal solution has a net export of, say, 200 megawatts, that constraint will prevent greenhouse gas attributions to resources with greenhouse gas bids in that BAA in excess of an aggregate amount of 200 megawatts. And of course, if the BAA is a net importer, you won't see any kind of attribution. So it's an incremental enhancement to the model, and it will have an impact on the prices, as you alluded. Today, because we consider all resources with greenhouse gas bids as being part of one general big area that doesn't have greenhouse gas regulation, and they're treated in the same way, you have a marginal greenhouse gas cost that is uniform in the entire area. Obviously, by making this distinction here, by adding additional constraints, when these constraints are binding, you will see some differentiation of the marginal greenhouse gas cost in this external area outside greenhouse gas regulation areas. Essentially, if this constraint that I'm describing is binding, will isolate in greenhouse gas marginal pricing sense that BAA from others. We don't see this as a problem in software because our software currently supports nodal greenhouse gas marginal components. So it's a change in the way that you will see a settlement, because each resource that has a greenhouse gas attribution receives a payment for the marginal greenhouse gas cost. So now all these costs are the same, but now you'll see potentially differentiation by BAA if those constraints that we described here become binding. But fundamentally, there's no change in the overall model, in the algorithm, or in the settlements. We don't expect any change.
Thanks for that explanation, George. I think what I'm trying to understand with respect to what you were just describing is, under that situation, if the deeming algorithm is constrained by the net export, won't that in effect be binding to the even in cases when supply in that BA and or transmission in that BA is still available? And so in other words, wouldn't it result in the marginal intensity in that BA setting that price all the time?
Mm-hmm. Depends on the amount of export that limits the attributions. It depends how the attribution, how the GHG bids in that BA stack, right? So let's say you have a merit order stack of greenhouse gas bids going in price from 0 up to $10, right? So let's say that in this hour, the net export transfer from that BAA is 200 megawatts. So you go through that merit order from low price to high price to find the first GHG attributions that add up to 200 megawatts. Of course, you do this overall for all BAAs, but let's assume that there's only one BAA here. And then at that point, you have your marginal greenhouse gas price, right? It's the last bid you take. Next hour, you have an export for 300 megawatts. So now you can go 100 megawatts deeper into that stack. So potentially you reach a higher price. So that's how the price can be different from each hour to the other. So it depends on the optimal solution.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think this is something that we can maybe discuss further, but I'll just give you an example of kind of what I'm struggling with. Imagine you have a BA that is hydro-based, so its entire supply is clean energy, zero emissions rate, and assume you've got 500 megawatts of surplus hydro in that BA, and you have 500 megawatts of transmission. So it's got the capability to potentially export up to 500 megawatts to the rest of the EIM area. If the dispatch ends up being, let's say, 100 megawatts of that resource is dispatched, so it's not, it hasn't exhausted the transmission or the supply in that BA. It seems like under that approach, the GHG price would be zero in that BA. And so I'm struggling with that. Pardon me?
You're correct. You're correct. If the constraint binds, because we limit the attribution to the amount of net export from that BAA, then there is a price separation in marginal greenhouse gas cost between that BAA and the rest of the non-greenhouse gas regulation area. This is equivalent to energy bidding. When you have a bid at an intertie, you have a set of bids at the intertie that are all at $0, all right? And that intertie becomes congested. Let's say the ITC hits the limit, then obviously the price at that intertie is zero, although the price inside the BAA could be higher than zero. So the same situation happens here because those greenhouse gas constraints limit the attribution. That constraint separates the greenhouse gas prices in that BAA from the rest.
Except for the fact that in my example, there is no congestion. If you've got 500 megawatts of supply and 500 megawatts of transmission, and you only get dispatched to, say, 100 megawatts, there is no congestion. So I think the issue is that in that scenario,
there's no flow. Yeah, there's no scheduling congestion. So the transfer is not at its scheduling limit. But if we want to limit the attribution to what the net export is, so that we don't attribute more than what is exported, right? That's the whole idea here. Then that is a constraint in the greenhouse gas attribution. So that constraint is binding. The scheduling.
I agree, but I guess my point is that the outcome that we're talking about under this example is that a clean BA with clean supply that's displacing emitting resources somewhere else, and there's no congestion and they have surplus, is getting a $0 price, and I just don't think that that's the right outcome. So I think
that's the right market outcome. That's the right outcome for the optimization, Jeff. You know that better than me. That when a constraint binds,
it
creates a price separation.
I agree that that's what the software would produce. I don't agree that that is the right outcome to the extent that there's no congestion and a BA has clean supply that it's making available to displace a marginal emitting resource somewhere else. The price for that should not be $0 in every hour in that BA. And I think that's what this would lead to. And I think that it's
yeah. Maybe it's semantics, Jeff, because if there is so much supply that is non-emitting, presumably the supply is at a low energy bid cost too. So why wouldn't be scheduled as an export from that BAA if there is such a surplus of supply? So actually the outcome that one would expect is that you'll probably maximize on the transfer. So the 200 megawatt transfer export will probably hit its export limit in this case, right? If you're describing surplus non-emitting supply, potentially at very low prices. It's very competitive. The energy optimization will actually schedule that supply to come out of that BA and serve load outside. So the expectation is that this export transfer will hit the limit. And then you don't have a problem, of course, when that constraint hits, to have a zero greenhouse gas price inside. That's the correct optimal outcome.
But George, think of it this way. You have 500 megawatts of surplus, 500 megawatts of transmission. You get dispatched for 1 megawatt of export. That will set that constraint and you'll have a $0 price. You get dispatched for 50 megawatts, you'll have a $0 price all the way up to 500. So no matter what the outcome is, the GHG price for that BA is $0 in all cases. I don't think that's right. That's what I'm.
But this is indirect, maybe, but well, that's what you think now. But when you presented this as a problem in your earlier presentation, you raised a big issue about it. You said we have attributions, although we're importing.
I agree.
This is my response. I'm trying to fix this problem, Jeff. You brought it up.
There is a problem when resources that are scheduled to meet load outside of the EIM area are deemed. I do not agree that the solution, though, should include the pricing outcomes we're describing here. This is a different issue that I'm raising associated with the proposal you have that I think needs to be thought through more carefully.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff, for that question. Do you have any other questions or comments or kind of practical questions about this?
No, not at this point. I appreciate the discussion with George, so thank you.
Yeah, that was good too. Okay. The next hand I saw up is Dan Williams. Dan, would you go ahead and raise your question?
Thanks, Kevin. Trying to remember exactly what I had before. That was an interesting back and forth there. But I think the question I had was just to go over again sort of that pricing dynamic between the day-ahead market and the real-time market. And I just want to make sure that I heard correctly that the idea is that we could have different prices for GHG out of day-ahead and real-time, and that, but that just because of how the market would settle in day-ahead, but that entities wouldn't be able to change their GHG price bid between day-ahead and real-time, though they could change the quantity. And I'm just wondering if you can talk through more sort of how that might impact the market and, you know, any unintended consequences or anything that might show up from the optimization there.
So this is Kevin. So Dan, just to make sure I understand, you're referring to what was on slide, I think it was either 13 or 14, where we were talking about, 14, where in the real time, if you have a day ahead bid at a certain price and megawatt quantity, and it rolls over into the real time, I believe that slide 14 explained that the price could be fixed, but the megawatts could change. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, just that whole transition of how the GHG price and schedules are established day ahead, and then what that implies for moving into the EIM.
Okay. Yeah.
I just didn't get the full connection between those two.
Okay. Anya or George, or do we have anybody else who might be able to answer?
James. Sure, James, do you want to take this from a settlements perspective?
Yeah, Adam, that's James Lynn from the California ISO. If you wouldn't mind unmuting his mic, that would be appreciated. James, maybe you can try raising your hand to make it pop a little bit more easily to Adam, the producer. James. let's see. I see him on the attendee list, but I see that his microphone is still muted. So there we go. I think it's unmuted now. James, you want to go ahead?
There we go. Yeah,
yep.
I kept on trying to raise my hand. I couldn't get to raise. Sorry.
Hey, no problem. Would you mind yourself just to the audience so they know who you are?
So this is James Lynn. I'm the Senior Advisor for Market Settlement Design. So what will happen is two things. In the day ahead, you will get an award potentially based upon your greenhouse gas bid and your energy dispatches. And then in real time, you'll have the opportunity to rebid in both your energy and your greenhouse gas award. And based upon the market optimization in real time, the real-time market may determine that your energy is better used to serve the non-greenhouse gas region versus the greenhouse gas region based upon other constraints, demand changes, all of the inputs that basically could require that there is a reoptimization of the market. Under that circumstance, then you would get a greenhouse gas attribution of 0 megawatts. And therefore, when I go and settlement says settlement of the real-time greenhouse gas awards, we're going to do it as a deviation settlement from day ahead. So if you had a 10 megawatt award in day ahead, this would basically be a charge back of 10 megawatts at the marginal greenhouse gas price of real time. In this case, it would be for 15 minutes, and then it could go into RTD. And then depending upon how the RTD solves, you could get potentially 5 megawatts back. So it basically is going to make the market's going to make a redetermination as to where is it best for your energy be used, the greenhouse gas region or the non-greenhouse gas region, based upon the awards coming out of the real-time market. Settlements will do a deviation settlement from day ahead.
Thanks, James. That makes sense to me. Dan, did that answer your question?
Yep. I just appreciate you walking through it a little more detail. Thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I think one thing is that it's my understanding under the ISO's proposal is that the RTD being the basis of the reporting to California Air Resources Board would not change.
That is correct, because that's your final reporting to final greenhouse gas attribution to serve the greenhouse gas region. So at that point, that would be what CARB would be looking at as to what is your final energy that you're delivering to California.
Great. Okay, folks, we're getting ready to transition over to George's component of the presentation. And I know that there's been a lot of information both in Anya's slides and discussed in the Q&A portion of that. But I encourage you to think a little bit more about the slides, and this is your opportunity to hear from the horse's mouth. Is that the right? From the directly from the source about how this approach might work. So if you don't feel that any of the questions that you posed in the homework assignments were answered, or if you're fuzzy on anything, please use this as an opportunity to do that. Because, assuming that we don't get a lot of questions out of this, we'll move straight into the evaluation of this approach in 1 week's time. So again, just reiterating that this is a great opportunity to ask questions, and I'd encourage you to do so. So thanks for letting me hop in there real quick. Back to the presenters.
Hello, good afternoon. This is George Angelis with the ISO. We'll walk through some slides for this part of the presentation, and this may look like deja vu for some of the participants that they also participate in the work group 1 on resource efficiency evaluation, since I made a similar presentation there. But there is also new information here in the slides because I revised them to capture the comments and feedback we received in that particular presentation. So to give you a background, in the work group 1, we were discussing alternatives for the structure of the resource efficiency evaluation. And we had a long journey, actually. We went through several different approaches, and now we are moving in the direction of having an optimization model performed in the resource efficiency evaluation to take the submitted energy bids from resources and produce an optimal solution that will calculate a feasible schedule for all the resources in the BAA that can meet the BAA's resource efficiency requirements, demand forecast, uncertainty, ancillary services, etc. And the objective is to minimize hourly failures, so try to pass the test, essentially. So if there are sufficient energy bids and sufficient flexibility in the resources that have these bids, then the happy outcome here is that, yeah, you can calculate a feasible schedule without violating any constraints, and that means you pass the test. And we resorted in an optimization model because we wanted to balance and co-optimize all available bids to meet the objective of passing the RSC while enforcing certain resource constraints that are also intertemporal in nature. So, for example, ramp rate capability limits, energy bid limits for all resources, that's easy, but daily energy limits for hydro resources, that is an intertemporal constraint across the entire time horizon. Also state of charge limits for storage resources, because we came to the realization that although these resources, they have energy bids, you cannot use the entire capacity under the energy bid every hour of the day, because there are energy limitations to it, and therefore we wanted to reflect those energy limitations in the approach that implements the resource efficiency evaluation, so that we have an accurate and reasonable resource efficiency evaluation. And also for VER forecast, we want to also limit VER resources with bids to the VER forecast, something that we intend to do also in IFM. Can I have the next slide, please? So the first presentation, it was my attempt to come up with this optimization model as simple as possible, because one of our objectives in working group 1 is to have a simple process for the resource efficiency evaluation that it doesn't take a lot of time to execute, so that we can make this available as an on-demand function for EDAM BAAs to come in and check on demand the resource efficiency evaluation results, so that if the tool identifies some shortages, they know where the shortages are, and then they can cure them with some process that they will develop to provide additional resources with bids in the market to meet the resource efficiency evaluation for the BAA. So the initial proposal was simplifying the model by ignoring a set of constraints. And the feedback that we got in that presentation was that maybe we went a step too far. It was articulated that unit commitment and intertemporal resources, and specifically resources, intertemporal constraints associated with multi-state generators, like their transitions, are important to have a reasonably accurate resource efficiency evaluation. And also, we can't ignore ancillary services and imbalanced reserves because it's capacity that is reserved and taken away from being used as energy to meet demand forecasts. So you have to consider this. ramp rates, we were proposing to use a flat weighted average ramp rate for simplicity. That was also criticized that it's too much of an approximation, and we should be using the dynamic ramp rates the way we use them in the IFM in the market. So we took that back, and the revised proposal that we're putting on the table now for a resource sufficiency evaluation optimization tool drops all the simplifications. So we will consider optimal unit commitment, all the temporal constraints associated with that, minimum up, downtime, daily starts, right? All the full model for MSGs with all the intertemporal constraints for transitions and transition times, okay? All ancillary services and imbalanced reserves, and dynamic ramp rates. The only thing that we stick to, and we draw the line here, is we still do not consider transmission constraints or scheduling limits of any kind. So no network for this optimization tool. It's like if all resources in the BA are all in the same bus. Okay? And for scheduling limits, we wouldn't have to consider them anyway on transfers because there are no transfers in this tool. We make an evaluation for each BA separately on how the resources for that BA will meet the requirements for that BA. The only transfer we consider is the bucket one transfer, of course. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I updated the notation here just for those that read through the next slides. There are equations so that we know what we're talking about. In the previous proposal, the model was calculating two feasible schedules, one that meets the upward requirement and another that meets the downward requirement. In this proposal, since we internalize ancillary services and imbalanced reserves in the same solution, then we calculate a single solution. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we have a similar objective function. This is your power balance requirement for its time and for its time period. Essentially, we make sure that the energy schedule, okay, and this is an advisory schedule that's calculated here in the resource efficiency evaluation. It's not used in the market, okay, meets the demand forecast. So that's your basically power balance requirement. And we introduced those two surplus variables, V and W, one in the upward direction, one in the downward direction, that basically are relaxation of that constraint. If they take value, that constraint is relaxed in that direction. And the objective of the resource sufficiency evaluation model here is to come up with a schedule, that EN, that meets the requirement every hour of the day without any violations. Then you pass the test. If any of those V or W variables take a value, that means the constraint is relaxed, means the optimization model could not find a feasible solution. So you didn't bring enough supply or flexibility in the market to pass the test. Of course, now we include all the other requirements for imbalanced reserves, up and down, regulation up, regulation down, and 10-minute contingency reserve. So you have all these requirements that need to be simultaneously met. And all these variables, energy, imbalanced reserve awards, ancillary service awards, they're all variables that are co-optimized now. So this is like a full optimization model, okay, where all the bits that are submitted for every commodity, they're all co-optimized to meet all the requirements, imbalanced reserve requirements, ancillary service requirements, and the demand forecast. So it's all a single optimization model trying to meet all the requirements, co-optimizing all the commodities. I'm only showing relaxation variables for the power balance. In reality, we do have relaxation variables also for the imbalanced reserve and ancillary service requirements, but I don't show this for simplicity. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this has not changed in fundamentals. These are all the capacity and rapid capability constraints that we enforce for resources. The capacity constraints now look a little different in this model because we introduce imbalance reserve and ancillary services. We had two constraints like that before. Everything was limited by the energy bid. Now, ancillary services are not limited by the energy bid, so we have four constraints. Imbalance reserves and energy are bound by the limits on the energy bid, upper economic limit, lower economic limit. And if you add the ancillary services, the limits become the upper operating limit and the lower operating limit. So we enforce all those. And this is similar to what we do in the market as well. So this model has the same constraints as the market, except for transmission constraints. And that's a key point, right? So we do exactly the same, we enforce exactly the same constraints that the market will enforce. Okay? Ramp capability constraints, you will probably recognize the ramp sharing constraint that shares the dynamic ramp capability. These are the dynamic functions, RRU, RRD for up and down ramp, okay, from the previous solution, from the previous interval. And the ramp capability is shared between energy ramping and ancillary services with those coefficients alpha, beta, and delta, exactly as we do it for the market. So it's exactly the same constraint. And on the right pane, you see this additional constraints that we wanted to bring into the resource efficiency evaluation, which led us to come up with this optimization model. The first constraint is the limit over the day of the energy by the daily energy limits, and this is a constraint that applies to hydro resources and pump storage hydro as well, okay, where there is a certain amount, upper bound and lower bound, on the water that can be discharged from the dam. So although the energy bids convey the potential that the capacity is available in any given hour, over the course of the day, you cannot use all of it because of these daily energy limits, and this is reflected here in this constraint. Similarly for the batteries, for storage resources, and I have a little mistake here. This meant to be the SOC is limited by upper and lower bounds, not the energy. So the state of charge for the device obviously has to be between its limits, and there are the energy model, the energy storage model, which is under there. It's the one that we use in the market that relates the state of charge of the device with the energy schedule. So essentially, you're trying to find a feasible energy schedule for storage devices that does not violate their storage, their SOC, the state of charge, over the day. Another constraint that we wanted to include in the resource efficiency evaluation, which again led to this optimization model. Key point that I want you to take out of here is that this is exactly what we will do in the market. This is exactly the same constraints that we enforce for resources in the market. We're not making any kind of simplification. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so the first objective function that you see here, it disregards bids. The objective here is to find a feasible schedule, not a least cost schedule, a feasible schedule. Basically, find a schedule over the day that satisfies all the constraints without any constraint violations. So basically, it minimizes the surplus variables, the V and the W, and of course others if we also have for the other constraints for ancillary services and imbalance reserves. I'm only showing those two. If the model is unable to find a solution where all the V's and all the W's are zero, then for every V or W in an hour that you have a value, that shows how short you are in meeting your upward or your downward target. So this is an indication that you failed the test in that direction. So the results are directly relatable because you can know exactly by how much you fail the test in which direction in any given hour. So you know exactly what you need to bring into the market to cure this problem. Now, once we arrive here, the next step, which is shown in the second bullet, introducing the bids, the bid prices, and doing an economic optimization is very small. So we have come a long way to get to this point. And the next step, having a full optimization using the bid prices and finding not only a feasible schedule, but also a least cost schedule, okay, it's very small. And this shows the objective function that now has the actual costs for energy, for imbalance reserve, for ancillary services based on the bid prices. So we minimize all that. And of course, now we have to penalize those M are high penalty prices. We have to penalize any constraint violations. And this is similar to the objective function that we have in the market, in IFM. So now this becomes like a mini IFM problem where we simply ignore transmission constraints. Now, why would we want to do that? We serve the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation already with the first objective function, where we don't use bid prices, because all we want to do is find a feasible solution. And for the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation, this is good enough. But now we're saying, well, let's take the next small step and calculate an optimal solution, a least cost solution. Why? Because this solution, remember, we're only doing this for one BAA at a time, ignoring any transfers. Bucket 1 transfers are already incorporated in those right-hand side limits for the requirements. So there are no transfers, it's one BAA at a time. If we get now this solution from the second bullet, from the second objective function, this is a solution that says how the BAA can meet its requirements on its own in an optimal fashion. Well, we were looking for that solution to use it as a counterfactual for calculating greenhouse gas attributions. Our counterfactual in EIM is the base schedule because it serves exactly that purpose. The base schedules convey information in EIM how a BAA can meet its own requirements with its own resources. And we do take into account their base transfers as well, similar to the bucket 1 transfers here. And we use this as counterfactual by limiting the greenhouse gas attributions in EIM to the amount, to the difference between the upper economic limit on the bid and the base schedule. Following the same approach, implementing a similar methodology for the EDAM, we are in need of a counterfactual in EDAM, and we cannot use base schedules because there are no base schedules that exist in EDAM. We start from zero, right? It's the first market we run. So this solution here, it's an optimal solution of how the BAA can meet its demand and ancillary services and imbalance reserve requirements. That is the perfect counterfactual we're looking for, and we can use it as a reference in the market that comes next to limit the greenhouse gas attribution using this solution as a reference. So now we came full circle with a full optimization model for the resource efficiency evaluation that we can actually use also as a reference for limiting greenhouse gas attributions in the market that comes next.
Hey, George.
The next slide. Yeah.
It's Kevin. So just to see if I'm caught up and maybe to bring other folks along if they were a little bit lost. So the idea here is that in the EIM today, we limit the greenhouse gas attribution in terms of megawatts to the difference between the upper economic limit and the base schedule. The issue is that in a day-ahead market, we don't have a base schedule against which we can compare. So we need some sort of other counterfactual. Previously, what was proposed was the use of the RUC D+1 solution. But as you raised in a previous meeting, it had certain shortcomings. And it just so happens that if we're looking for a counterfactual, the one that's being proposed in the RSE working group might work to serve that purpose. And the explanations and formulas that you were just giving are a preview of how that optimization might work if that is pursued in the RSE working group. And the advantages of that is that it's an accurate counterfactual because it considers all of the things that you had just mentioned. And importantly, does not include transmission between different balancing areas. In other words, it's the generation that they would need each BA to meet their own load, which is an analogous concept to a base schedule. So it's appropriate to use in the day-ahead horizon, just as the base schedule is appropriate to use in the real-time horizon. Did I get that right?
Oh, absolutely. You said it better than me, Kevin. Indeed, this approach here is using the same input data that will be used in the market. The RACT+1 approach was an approximation because you have to use potentially financially non-binding bids yet from the day before and a 2-day ahead forecast, which is less accurate than the day ahead forecast that the market's going to use. But here, now we're eliminating all these approximations, and we're using exactly the same data. We're using exactly the methodology that will be used to produce the AFM schedules. We're only ignoring transmission constraints inside the BAA. Between BAAs, they're immaterial because we're not even considering anything across BAAs in this resource efficiency evaluation. Yeah. It's on a BA by BA basis. Even if we do them for all simultaneously, they're still individually done. It's like they're detached optimization problems, one for each BAA. So, in fact, at this endpoint, I can claim that we reached the ultimate destination of our long journey in both working group 1 and 3. It is not possible. I'm very, very adamant in this. It is not possible to improve this any way more. This is really like running the market before the market, and I may need to bang my head on the wall because when we started all this discussion, I was the one saying, well, we don't want to run the market before the market, and here we are now. We're actually going to be running the market before the market. Now,
yeah. Sorry. So we have some people lining up, and we've got about 15 minutes left. Do you want to go through these last bit of? I think you just have one, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, it's just the last slide.
Yeah.
And then we'll open it for questions. Yes. So, what do we get here? So it's a model that can be executed for each BA separately or in parallel for all BAs when we run it at regular time intervals like 9 and 10 a.m. It's a single test for anything that we want to do in the resource efficiency evaluation. So this is a test for both upward and downward, both capacity and flexibility. It's done in one shot because we have simultaneously optimizing, meeting both upward and downward requirements, and the ramp capability constraints are enforced in it, so the flexibility is already embedded in it. So we do just one test, and we have the results for both up and down, both capacity and flexibility. You can't do any better, really. Hourly failures and hourly shortfalls are identified, so you know exactly what you need to do to cure any insufficiency. And of course, the added benefit here, and it's not small, that we can use the optimal schedule as a counterfactual for greenhouse gas resource-specific attribution. I inquired a little bit with my technology team, and because of the fact that we don't need to have a network for this, it's a very important simplification not to have transmission network in it. This is a simple one-shot solution. Don't even need iterations, and we don't need to calculate any prices because we only want the schedule. Okay, so we don't even have to do crossover. We don't have to do pricing run. It's just a single scheduling run for one BA at a time. So we're looking at something that probably won't take more than 5 minutes. So we're even at the point that we can say that we will be able to find a technology solution to make this available on demand for EDAM BAAs. So really, we're checking all the boxes here, and there's nothing left unchecked. We can open for questions and discussion.
Yeah, this was great. So I'll call on the next. There's 4 people who have their hand raised. Let's just keep in mind that we're not here to debate the merits of how this would work, I'd prefer to keep that in the RSE working group. So if your questions are about, how a certain constraint might bind or what new, things should be added to the RSE optimization, at this point, let's try to keep the questions focused on how it would interact with the greenhouse gas accounting questions that we're dealing with in this working group. So let me, with that, go to Alva Svoboda. So Alva, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. This is Alva Svoboda from PG&E. I think I'm looking forward to hearing this again tomorrow, George, since we haven't actually heard this in the RSE group. I really think it's an excellent approach, but I did want to point out one, I don't know if it's a deficiency, but one significant attribute of this solution that would be different from whatever you wind up with in the IFM/RUC process. You basically have to do this optimization against not bid-in loads, but the load forecast for this to be a meaningful test of feasibility. And so therefore, the actual schedules these so-called base schedules, are not going to be identical to the day-ahead schedules. And so that is just one issue that would have to be considered in terms of the use of these as base schedule. I still think this is an excellent approach. I certainly don't favor the first objective function, but I think for purposes of iteration, it might be useful. But I do think there's an issue you have to grapple with in terms of the load forecast versus the bid-in load. Thank you.
I agree, Alva. Thanks. But yeah.
Thank you, Alva. Just a moment, Kevin. Alva, our objective here is not calculate an optimal schedule for meeting scheduled load, right? We want to calculate a schedule that can satisfy the requirements, and the demand forecasts the requirements. So yes, of course it will be different, and what the market will calculate, but we expect it to be different, right? We don't want to calculate the market schedule here. It's just an advisory schedule that we want to make sure that it's feasible, right? So I think we're okay. This is not a deficiency. This is an objective.
The thing is, if we distinguish how we were talking about using this in the RSE as kind of a calculation of effectively what's the backstop price you're going to charge BAAs for being infeasible, because there you're just measuring the deficiency, and you've sort of cast in that light in the way you're describing it, but there's an issue of the individual resource schedules here that might be more concerning than what you're saying. I'm not sure because I'm just hearing this the first time, but it does seem like when you talk about base schedules, you're talking about what you're going to attribute to actual resources. And so it's not just the BAA level view that's the consideration here.
I guess we can take it up in the discussion tomorrow then.
Yeah. Thank you very much, George.
Yeah. Thanks, George, and thanks, Alva. That was a good question. The next hand I saw, I'll call on Callie Wells. And just a reminder, guys, we have about 10 minutes. I want to give Brian a chance to do his debrief. So Callie, go ahead.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I'll keep this short because actually my questions were along the same lines. I think it's what is our counterfactual? Should it be, what the IFM would have done absent transfers? And I think maybe that's what Alva was getting at is, bid and demand versus forecast. Virtuals are also part of that equation. But my big question is, if I understand this correctly, you are not modeling internal transmission within a BA. So I do wonder how the base schedules might be different because of that. You have a lot of renewable resources possibly behind transmission constraints. So if you don't model that, you might have base schedules higher than what they would be if you do model the transmission constraints. So I'm not sure if you guys can elaborate a little bit more on your thinking of that. Maybe it's not that big of an issue, but it was something that came to mind.
Yeah, and I'm not going to elaborate a lot, Kelly, because this is really out of scope for the resource efficiency evaluation. We never had any intention to consider transmission constraints. In fact, when we started this discussion, we didn't have intention to consider any of these constraints that go on in here. And in relation to the transmission constraints, how they're used in the resource efficiency evaluation EIM, you know that they're not. So it was never part of the resource efficiency evaluation scope to consider transmission constraints. To answer your question, yes, what we calculate here as the optimal solution will be different than what IFM would calculate for many reasons. For virtuals, which we don't consider in the attribution, for load bids, for transmission constraints, but that's not our objective, right? Our objective is to see if the BAA brings enough resources to meet the requirements, and we threw all the constraints that affect resources. Yes, we don't handle transmission constraints.
Yeah, I agree with that for the RSC for purposes of RSC, but if you're using that scheduling results for also purposes of GHG attribution, that is my question, is are those schedules coming out of this RSC optimization that's ignoring transmission constraints going to be different than what would have been a base schedule for GHG attribution purposes? Because when you go to run the actual model in the IFM, you will have the transmission, so you could have cases where renewable resources behind a transmission constraint have higher base schedules than they would have had the initial counterfactual run taken into account transmission constraints. So I agree with the RSC, but if you're also using that for purposes of GHG, that's where my question comes into play. Yeah,
but for GHG, we already said that GHG attributions ignore virtuals, right? So you couldn't use an IFM solution as a counterfactual for greenhouse gas attributions anyway, because the greenhouse gas attributions ignore virtual supply, right? So we're already far from what IFM would potentially calculate anyway. But your comments are noted.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Good questions. I'll move on to Todd Ryan. Todd, would you go ahead and introduce yourself? And Alva and Callie, if you guys don't have any more questions, if you wouldn't mind lowering your hands. But Todd Ryan, go ahead.
Hi, this is Todd Ryan from PG&E. I would just like to say that I think this is a good step forward. I'd like to commend the CAISO for coming up with a solution, and I want to highlight it because I think it has benefits across all the working groups. I think it seems to be an elegant solution for highly accurate solution for RSE, but it also could have benefits, as noted here for GHG accounting, but also for measuring the benefits of EDAM or for market monitoring or, transmission uses we haven't even thought of yet. I think having a strong counterfactual will have many uses. So I realize there's still many details to discuss and look forward to working through them in working group 1. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. The next hand and the last hand that I see up is Aditya. Would you go ahead?
Hi, good afternoon. This is Aditya from Southern California Edison. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. George, thank you so much for laying out this presentation. Appreciate it very much. First, actually, two quick questions. Well, one quick question at least. First one, if you could go to slide 21, I believe. Could you tell me what the capital MB and the capital MW are?
Yes, and forgive me, I didn't probably add that in the notation, my omission. So these are the penalty prices that we assign to constraint violations, and we add them in the objective function essentially to make sure that those surplus variables that relax constraints, they only take value if they have to, if we can't find a feasible solution. So you want to exhaust all economic bids first in trying to meet the requirements, and if you still cannot meet the requirements, then you violate the constraint at a high penalty, and these are the M's are the high penalty prices that, like we use today in IFM in the scheduling run to penalize constraint violations.
Gotcha, thank you. Could we go real quick to slide 19? So in the power balance constraint, I know that in California we have virtual bidding. I don't know if they're elsewhere, but virtual bids should be entering the power balance constraint, and I don't see them there. Could you opine on that? And given that they should be entering, what would happen to the rest of the formulation?
Correct. Yeah, virtual bits are not part of this formulation because the resource efficiency evaluation is based on physical resources. So the test is do BAS bring sufficient physical supply and flexibility to meet the requirements. So that's why the test never intended to use virtual bits or virtual supply or virtual demand. And that's why you don't see them in this problem formulation. And similarly, for the greenhouse gas attribution, as I just said to Callie earlier, the greenhouse gas attribution also ignores virtual supply. We only attribute to physical resources. So those two come together here. So that's why this solution is also suitable as a counterfactual for greenhouse gas attribution. So there are no virtuals here, yes.
Okay, so thank you. The EN, the energy schedule, the first variable, that is impacted by virtuals. So once that is impacted, also you'll have the VT and WT impacted by virtuals. So at least for California, virtuals need to be considered. I understand.
Not in this solution. So in IFM, yes, you're correct. In IFM, you do have virtual supply and virtual demand that are control variables. They have a prices. You calculate them optimally, but not here. Here, they're not even represented. They're not part of the solution. We're not even looking at them. We're only looking to physical supply that is coming into the market. And that's what we optimize to see if there's sufficient physical supply to meet the requirements. That's the purpose of the test. Considering virtual supply will make the resource efficiency evaluation test a virtual test. You will always be able to pass it. So what's the point, right?
I think if I can make myself clearer. So assume there's a lot of virtual supply. That'll displace the physical supply, so you'll have a smaller value of EN.
In IFM. In IFM.
Over here. Yeah, I mean, from
IFM.
But the EN is from IFM, isn't it?
No. So this is a solution that is run before IFM. We haven't run the market yet. And this EN is the potential physical schedule that is optimized to meet the requirements for the BAA, ignoring virtual bits, because that's the purpose of the test. Do you have enough physical supply to meet your requirements? So we're not running the IFM yet. In the IFM, yes, that EN extends to virtual supply and virtual demand as well, but not in this problem. In this problem, EN is only the physical resource schedule. That's what we're looking for. And this is just advisory. We throw it away after the resource efficiency evaluation. We only keep it as a counterfactual for greenhouse gas attribution. Then the IFM will actually calculate day-ahead schedules for both physical and virtual supply. Okay?
Thank you. So the EN is from before the IFM is run, basically produced by CAISO, and but the IRU and IRD are after the IFM, right? Because IRU and IRD would have to come out of the IFM.
So this isn't
maybe
entirely.
I should have added some. Yeah, maybe I should have added some prime into this variable. So these are not the results of the IFM. This
okay,
is
none of these are.
A trial run. Yeah,
gotcha.
This is, we say we have an imbalance reserve up requirement. How would this co-optimization between energy and imbalance reserve would solve the problem of meeting the demand forecast and the imbalance reserve up requirements? But these are results that we're not going to settle on, right? So when we go into the IFM, we'll calculate the actual day-ahead schedule for these commodities, and we'll settle them. Here, this is just a test.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question, and thank you. And thank you to George and Anya for this great presentation. And I can tell you that it answered a lot of my questions, and I feel that we're in a lot better of a situation here. So with that, I will kick it over to Brian Jacobson to do the debrief. And then Brian, if you wouldn't mind just doing it, sending it back to me after you're done to talk about next Tuesday. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, I'll try and keep it brief given our time constraint here. So in our discussion today, we covered the slides in sections and then opened it up for questions intermittently. In the first set of questions, we had some clarifications around pseudotied resources that would be contracted to a GHG zone and how would they be treated. Also had a discussion around self-schedules and how energy bids on top of that would look like, and then also on joint-owned unit scenarios. And then in the discussion on multiple greenhouse gas zones, the scenarios discussed with linkage and without linkage. There was a general question about what defines linkage, and there we deferred that the EDAM is not intending to design or define linkage. Rather, those definitions are with the policy regulators, CARB and Washington currently. We would look to support that. And then in the next series of questions, we had some discussion around the proposal for a new constraint around BAA net exports. There was a good discussion around that. Take that back for the design. And then also a discussion around the linkage between the day ahead and the real time as it relates to settlements. James Lynn gave us a good overview of that. And then finally noting on that the reporting to CARB is still only with the real-time market, not with the day ahead. And then finally, on the last set of slides, we had questions about the differences between solving for the counterfactual against load forecast versus bid-in demand, and then also a discussion around the implications of not having internal constraints in that counterfactual run, and George gave a response to that. So that's my summary of the discussion notes. I'll include those in the weekly report. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Brian. Cool. I think you caught everything, and I'll just encourage folks to do a little bit of reviewing the slides to see if there's any lingering questions, and maybe we can carve out some time in a subsequent meeting if there's anything left over. And as always, we have our commenting tool that's posted onto the ISO website, and there's a link to that in the slides. Not the commenting tool, but it's a Survey Monkey thing where you can send in questions, comments, and there's a link to that in this slide deck. So, feel free to send those in. The next meeting on Tuesday, we'll have a presentation from folks at PowerX and Public Generating Pool talking about the unspecified / zonal approach, which is an alternative to the model that was presented today. So everybody, I hope you have a chance to tune into that one too, because it'll be another lively discussion. And then in the subsequent meetings, we will sort of take those approaches and do an evaluation and mold them over as a working group. So with that, I think we can close it down. Thanks, everybody, and thanks again, especially to the folks from the California ISO who presented this resource-specific approach and answered the questions. So thanks, everybody, and have a good day.